let's kick off. So welcome everybody. To introduce myself first, I'm Michelle Wallace. I look after operations and communications for Host in Ireland. On the call, we also have Mark Foley, who's CEO of Eirgrid. We have Tom Parlon, Director General of the Construction Industry Federation, and of course, Garry Connolly, who is the founder and president of Host in Ireland.
Hello, everybody.
I suppose this is to launch our quarterly report. It's the first one of 2020. This is the 9th report in the series. So they started back in 2017. And really the report reflects the first quarter of data. You know, we track the power, the amount of data centers, but also, you know, because the first quarter was really only 2 weeks into the COVID measures, but the commentary covers, you know, a lot more. And although this was launched during the greatest upheaval to our daily lives, probably since World War II, and what we're experiencing as a society is that we're more connected than ever before. So there's some kind of really interesting stuff in the report in that actually this is one of the frontline services. And so, you know, the industry itself hasn't been massively affected to date. And look at this webinar, it wouldn't even be possible without Zoom, who expanded from 10 million users in December to 300 million users now with the help of the likes of Equinix. And the same for so many other applications from Netflix and YouTube to Microsoft. But what we've started to do in this report, and what's quite remarkable, is we're looking and investigating, and thanks to Dave McCauley and BitPower who helped us with this, was investigating the trajectory of carbon outputs from the industry with the growth of the industry. And I think some of those outputs are quite surprising and probably go against some of the myths that exist in the industry. So Garry, I suppose to start with you on that point, do you want to tell us a little bit more about the report itself and the findings of it and the carbon impact of the industry?
And thank you, Michelle, and welcome everybody, and Mark and Tom, you're very welcome. Looking forward to this session immensely. The first thing I'd like to do is actually, as a father and as a brother and as a householder here in the beautiful Enniskerry, is a big shout out and thanks to the data center community. You know, as you've rightly said, 5 years ago, there wouldn't have been any normal should we not have had the design, the build, and indeed now the operation of the platforms that allow us to have this type of communication. And I think for an industry and a group of people who aren't always best represented or fairly representative, to have been established initially as essential workers was a wonderful recognition for those workers. And when I talk to the Equinixes and Digital Realties and Equinix and Keppel, etc., there's a real sense of purpose among that community now, which is very good, because they've always been the background guys, but now they're supporting the healthcare workers. They're keeping us all sane with Netflix and Zoom, and of kids inside here working in school. So I think if people don't have a sense of what a data center does or how it operates, it's the backbone behind all that we are right now. You know, anything that has smart in front has the data center behind. So personally, I work on the industry, I don't work in it. And I just like to thank them for all their perseverance and work over the previous years. Because as I say, Spotify and me have a real love affair now, and it's only because of you guys. Regarding the report, yes, Michelle, you said there earlier, this is our 10th report every quarter going back to 2017. And we've always tried to give a fair, reasonable, timely and accurate reflection on the market, irrespective of whether it was going for the industry or against the industry. So we've always had the capital spend, we've always had the growth. And you know, when you think of data in Ireland and you think that it goes back to the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, all we are doing is a continuation of that in the foreign direct investment space for data centers in the centers and being exported. So when you consider, we looked at that and we said, what is the big topic right now? Well, the big topic right now globally is the pandemic. But just behind that or in front of that and still to come will be global warming, the climate challenge. So we felt the most appropriate thing now was to try and debunk some of the myths in Ireland regarding the role data centers has. And for me, if there is one area, and we read always about these fines that are coming in for carbon, etc., for Ireland. You know, Ireland as a society has 3 or 4 different elements that is contributing to that carbon number. And if there's one area that is performing in line that we should be proud of, is the decarbonisation of our electrical system, irrespective of data centres. So when you look at that, we took all the information, the science that the Sustainable Energy Association of Ireland had, the Environmental Protection Agency had, Eirgrid, we've got their CEO today, and obviously also the Irish Wind Energy, the Irish Solar Energy Association. We put it all on a set of metrics. And actually 40% this year looks very achievable for Ireland for the decarbonisation of our grid. So then you lay on top of that the growth of the data centres. And then you see, well, in actual fact, was a lot of people talk about, you know, data centers are all about the consumption. They're actually writing out the checks that are needed a lot of the time for the actual infrastructure as well and the supply. And we have come up with sort of a number of new metrics that demonstrate, rather than concentrating on the consumption percentage of 20% or 15% or 18%, what's its actual carbon percentage as a percentage of the overall? Because that's what we're all now going to have to challenge. And that's what's reflected this particular quarter, Michelle. That percentage between 1.5 and 2.2% of Ireland's, even though as we look forward into the next 3 to 5 years, our capital spend and growth for data centers is still over that 5 years at 7 billion. So that hasn't changed due to the pandemic. In fact, what we're seeing, and it's reflected in the report as well, is due to Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and the co-location guys effectively saying that what's happened in 2 months is equivalent to 2 years in the digitalization of the planet. In fact, a lot of the projects that we're looking at 2022 are now being brought forward. And I know Tom has some comments about some of the data center projects that are actually chomping at the bit to get back. And that's a wonderful thing, because it's not, we can't say that right now about all industries in Ireland, from aviation through to retail, through to hospitality, that we have an industry here that is chomping at the bit to get going again, to get people back to the next new normal. And it's all reflected in the report. So in summary, we've tried to debunk and give some real, genuine, timely and accurate numbers on, well, what is the carbon overhead of data centers? Not the percentage of electricity, but the carbon overhead. And secondly, to demonstrate that it is a really industry of substance, from the design, build, operating, and we're ready to go as soon and as the different restrictions and phases are lifted. And that's really the message that comes out of the report.
Garry, do you mind if I'm just going to share a quick slide, actually. I think that just shows this. So I think this is kind of what you're getting at.
Yeah.
Do you mind just kind of explaining that a little bit?
So there's 2 aspects to this. There's the legacy, which is obviously demonstrating that Ireland, for the purpose of this discussion, whilst we had an element of decarbonisation of the grid, what does that mean? Well, it's more renewable energy sources coming onto the grid and being managed on the grid. And if you look back to, it's incredible to think that we were a first mover back in the last century with hydro. But really, since the Irish Wind Energy Association have started to really put wind onto the grid, you can see there that the CO2 aspect of electricity in Ireland is going very much on a downward trend. Data centers, as you see, are going on an upward trend. And when you look at the fact that data centers now, and I guess people have two views on this. There are 4 companies in Europe responsible for 80% of data center activity. And they are Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and Microsoft, I think. So it's no different in Ireland. The positive thing for us as a nation is that all 4 of them, publicly linked to their share prices, linked to their corporate social responsibility, have stated that they will either be carbon neutral or carbon negative by the end of the decade. So it's not just for the data centers, it's not just for Ireland. They're the purchasers. So effectively, they will be purchasing, and we haven't gone down, Michelle, which is important, the very complex and very misunderstood world of corporate power purchase agreements. We have decided to stick very clearly to what is, if all the data centers were just to take the electricity off the wire, what's its decarbonisation, rather than getting into these complex corporate carbon type models. So as you can see, the data centers will level off. The electricity is decarbonising. And that really is a lovely link into what Mark, I'm sure, is going to talk about, which is the technical challenges that you would expect in such a transformation. And effectively, like, we're technology people, we're used to change. We change all the time. We indeed, in Ireland, as you know, we were the largest software exporter 20 years ago on floppy disks. Now, if we had stayed with floppy disks, who used a floppy disk in the last decade? It's migrated to the cloud. So we're going to see naturally change and innovation and a different way of thinking for the grid, which won't look anything like technologically what it did 10 years ago, never mind 10 years ahead. So it's a lovely link, I think, to Mark then to talk about the challenges that presents and the opportunities.
Thank you very much, Gary. Just as a bit of a lead in, a couple of comments. Firstly, sincere thanks to your sector. I've got 500 people working at home at the moment, incredibly successfully. It has been an extraordinary social experiment, and it's going exceedingly well. And I have no doubt it's going to change the work paradigm of the future. So sincere thanks on that front to your sector. Secondly, your report, very pleased and impressed that you're reconstructing the narrative around data centers. I found myself in the last year in particular coming under strong questioning from journalists about data centers and presenting quite a negative narrative in relation to data centers. You're changing that narrative, and that's really, really important. And you're putting a proper analytical perspective on A, the benefits, and B, the carbon intensity. So I really welcome this report today, and we need more of this to inform the narrative we're going to have for the sector and the power system, indeed, in terms of journalists and winning hearts and minds around the country. In terms of what lies ahead, I've said publicly, and I really think this is true, if you look back on Ireland's 100-year history, the Climate Action Plan is as seminal a piece of government policy and ambition as we've seen in 100 years. It's as big as that, because today we have a power system with approximately 4,500 megawatts of renewables, backstopping 35% performance last year on average, 50% power on the system from renewables in January, February, March of this year, a staggering statistic. But where we've to get to in 2030 is somewhat mind-blowing. That 5,000 megawatts has to become 15,000 megawatts. We have to do in 10 years twice what we did in the last 15 to 20. And we also have to embrace new technologies. Onshore wind ecosystem is outstanding, and we need more of that. But the Irish Sea needs to be massively populated with the offshore proposition, which brings scale and enormous capacity. And the government's announcement last week of giving relevant project status to 7 projects. And of course, SSE have a major project off Arklow. That is a revolution that must happen, because without it, it isn't going to happen for us. And thirdly, we have to embrace solar technology, which is well established, very, very low cost. And I know it surprises people, but there are parts of Ireland that can deliver at a very competitive price using solar technology. The other dimension is interconnection. There was a staggering statistic. It was either Friday or Saturday, so I tweeted it. I can't remember what day. But the total amount of wind energy on the Irish system was pushing close to 80%. Now, we weren't using all of that in Ireland because we can't handle, for technical reasons, any more than 65. But the interconnector between Ireland and the UK was absolutely maxed out, supplying wind, basically onshore wind, into the UK. That's a little cameo, a little picture of what the future is going to look like. And of course, a critical part of that is to build more interconnection. And we recently, actually in the last couple of days, put out our final consultation process report in respect of the Celtic Interconnector, which is a massive project to connect Ireland to France, 700 megawatts. And if the Celtic Interconnector had been functioning last weekend, we'd have been close to 100% renewables on the power system. So some staggering issues and opportunities ahead. On the actual power system itself, so within Ireland and on the transmission system, we have very significant upgrades to do and very significant strengthening. It's one thing to put offshore wind out in the Irish Sea. The next thing is to make sure that the system from Arklow through Dublin and up to Dundalk is actually capable of taking it on board and shipping it into Dublin where the big demand is, or indeed to any other parts of the country. So our next 5-year capital program focuses enormously on building that infrastructure, upgrading wires, and this is a crucial part of it, because where you can, if you can upgrade the capacity of existing wires, you're spared that awful challenge of trying to get infrastructure over the line in difficult places where there's high there's a lot of people living. The other issue is technology. The grid will look very, very differently over the next 5 to 10 years as you start to see devices on the power system which can control flow, control voltage, etc. And you're starting to see the emergence of battery technology, which keeps the grid stable when there's very, very high levels of renewables on the system. And our DS3 Plus program will really be the stimulant for all of that technological innovation on the grid, working with partners and working with technologists to put devices on which can make all this happen. So as big as it, your industry changes rapidly day by day. The power system sector has tended to change very slowly by comparison with, say, ICT data centers, but it's facing its biggest transformation since rural electrification in the next 10 years. And I'm comforted and confident for one reason, a couple of reasons. One, the Climate Action Plan sets the direction, it provides the North Star. Secondly, the ecosystem's there. The ecosystem is there in terms of the development community and in terms of our own capabilities. And finally, to bust the myth about cost, the vast bulk of capital to do this will actually come from the private sector. Onshore wind, offshore wind, solar. Our requirements in all of this in the next 5 years are about $1 billion. $1 billion on the Irish network and $1 billion interconnector into France. The development community are going to spend billions. They have access to the cash, they've got the balance sheets, and they have the capability. So there's an unhealthy narrative going around that the state will have to fund all of this. It's not true.
Well, there's another data center myth busted right there, Mark. Thanks for that. Sorry, Garry, you were going to say something there?
No, I was just going to ask, do you think, I think there was a 9 billion numbers floating around last year. Do you think maybe that there's some confusion as to when you combine the state and the private, it's in and around that number as distinct to, because you have always said with your 2020-2025 strategy that you had 2 billion to spend. So obviously the other 7 is either not there or it's private.
I don't know the provenance of that number. The number that is robust is if you look at the government's National Development Plan, which I think is, Tom will know this better than I think it's 105 billion. They had allocated 25 billion within that to the total decarbonisation challenge, which is a combination of state and private capital over the next 10 years. I think that's probably the best number to be using here. I don't know what the provenance is of that number that was floating around last year. It's only part of the picture, and I think all it has done is cause confusion.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. In terms of COVID-19 and the impact of that, obviously this is, you know, there's the decarbonisation of the grid is progressing, but the impact of COVID-19, what are you seeing as the impact, and are there opportunities to come out of that?
Look, the biggest impact has been in the sector Tom represents. We've had no construction, or up to whatever date it was, the beginning of last week. All of our activities were shut down, bar absolutely critical maintenance, like a wire going down. That's hurting us because upgrades are not being done, substations not being refurbished, connections of including data centres, work not happening in that space, and generators who need to do overhauls can't get technicians in from Germany and other places to do that. So that has really hurt. We've been looking at this forensically because some of the calls we have to make in the next couple of months are around ensuring that we make the correct calls and we don't have issues cascading into next year. So I am absolutely delighted that construction sector back at work. I was asking Tom earlier before we came online, are they looking at sort of extended working hours because of the fabulous weather we have? And to grab the opportunity of trying to restore some of the lost productive time, and equally, you know, work our way back up to full productivity as soon as possible. So that's my biggest concern, that it'll do damage to 5-year programs because of work that's on critical paths that got impacted.
Yeah, indeed. And actually that probably leads into you, Tom, quite well then on the, you know, on the construction side of things. I suppose one of the key indicators of economic change is always in construction. And one of the great things that we're seeing in this report is, you know, we're seeing continued investment. The projection of kind of a 1.3 million spend per year up to 2025 is still steady for the industry. We're seeing a small bump this year, probably of about 10 to 15%, but that's got to be encouraging for your sector to see, you know, a steady growth.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that maybe some other sectors are threatened by some of the investments that were in the pipeline. So it's certainly reassuring to see that the whole data center industry has such a massive ambition, and like we're big. I know that the Facebook site was closed down ahead of most of the national industry. It was a corporate decision taken at West Coast level, but that's opened up now, and it's starting on a gradual return. And I expect in a couple of weeks' time there will be 1,400 people working on that site. And as Mark said, it will have to encompass a sort of a staggered shifts. And those negotiations with the unions are just happening at the moment. But 1.3 billion is a big spend. And while that's very important in the country, the initial, I suppose, experience that our companies gained here in Ireland now has been spread. And I think, you know, we've effectively generated really good reputation abroad. And I think about 7,000 Irish people are working in the industry right across Europe. Which is very important as well. Just as Mark said, that's causing some difficulties. Access you know, in and out of the country with 14-day sort of isolation and all the difficulties to go with that are certainly challenging at the moment. But I think, just like has been said, I think all industries discover the importance of data, of platforms. I didn't really know what Zoom meant before this happened, and now, Jesus, I'm almost zoomed out. And it certainly, in terms of getting productivity out of people, it's incredible. You'd think that because people are home, that there's an opportunity to take more time off or to DOS, but Zoom seems to just sort of, you know, control people very, very strongly. And it's a wonderful method. Now, I'm in my office now, and there's a small group of us here, maybe 6 of us. But it does work very, very effectively. And I think it gives an indication, you know, of how important that whole business is. And the data centers clearly are central to the digital economy. And there was an article today by Pat Doherty, I'm not sure if any of you saw it, the chief executive of ESB, but he has one quote there. He said, "What seemed far-fetched can quickly become reality." I didn't expect that we would have a total online, that we could have a total online training offer. And yet we passed out our normal training budget last month with an entire online training facility. Now, I do appreciate people weren't working, so I suppose their employers and themselves thought they would upskill themselves and so on. So, like, the opportunities are endless. And certainly in terms of the whole electricity grid and the green element of that, I suppose we're in a strange time at the minute. We're about to have the formation of a new government that is going to be multicolored. And, you know, there's going to be at least 4 strands, I'd say. We have our traditional 2 parties, which is historic that they're going to come together into one government. Green Party look fairly destined to be in government, and a group of independents as well. So, but we are going to have regardless of who's in there is going to be quite a green agenda. I think everybody has bought into that. And I come from County Offaly down in the Midlands, where Bord na Móna and peat production and peat power was a big factor. And I do see in yesterday's EU government or support for different economies, this new concept of just tradition is a big factor, and there's multi-million package in Ireland for that. And I'm aware of a particular exciting project, well, I think anyhow, is this battery park that's been built, and a couple of our members are involved in that down on the site of a former power station. I know solar, lots of plans for it in the Midlands and so on. So it is there are exciting opportunities, and I certainly will look forward to the day we'll have a good data center down around Ferban, somewhere at Barry as well. But it has upskilled, I think our involvement in the data center has upskilled our industry. It has allowed us to have the capacity and the skills to compete at international level. And I think we're very well placed to be involved in the 1.3 billion spend that is forecast now over the next number of years.
Great, thank you. And just on that point that you made about the export of skills and services, you know, and we see that so much in our industry, that because Ireland has become this, you know, centre of excellence and the largest data centre market in Europe, and in fact outside of the US, I think that's the kind of skills that have developed here have enabled us to export them, you know, all over Europe, all over the world. And that's something I know that our partners are really proud of, you know, and hopefully now as things start to open up, we can ensure that that's has as little damage as possible. But it's great that you mentioned that. In terms of, Garry, have you got anything there to add, or any questions for Mark or Tom before we move into the audience questions?
I just think that one of the things that often gets lost, and I think both Tom and Mark have both said it, is the reason that you have centers is because of the proliferation of data. It's a real thing. It's a real asset. It's a real value. So while all the traditional factories, potentially around the world, but in particular Ireland, have been closed for the last 6 to 8 weeks, the digital factories are still functioning. The digital factories are still exporting. There's still pumping out part of the 89 billion, which is the export value of ICT and services to Ireland, the largest export category. They've still been functioning. And always remember, we should be very proud of the fact, and we don't do this enough, is that the centres that we see now in Ireland are simply an evolution of the fact that we were so good at localization and software production in the 80s, the 90s, and we've just migrated across to the new form, which is called the cloud. And that, as Tom rightly said, why did we get the pedigree in data center design, build, and operation? But it actually goes back to Intel and the pharmaceutical people that were in the 80s. The skills and we were ready. So like what Mark is saying as well, he's going to start to see innovation and evolution. The data center industry is constantly evolving. And now there's no such thing as a non-green data center. So if we say we are going to be X, Y, and Z in the green space, that's only a me too in a year, maybe even now. Because everywhere else in Europe that's competing with us is the same story. What will differentiate us, which always has in the past, is our can-do approach from the people. That's okay. We'll do it. That's okay. We'll get over it. We've been doing this for foreign direct investment companies for 60 years. And the dividend is now being found with our contractors, our design people, all over Europe. But the digital factories are still open, even now, functioning at, in some cases, in Microsoft, for instance, at 700% above what they were pre-COVID. 700%. And that's real value and real money that's monetized via the data centers in Dublin. Often forgotten that these things actually are digital factories with Spotify and Netflix and all these things. So yes, that's one point that we often miss, that this is just an evolution of what we've been doing for a long time.
Gary, on that, I've used the analogy in a recent interview with the Sunday Business Post, which is nobody questions and everybody is delighted to have the top 9 pharmaceutical companies in the world here. And nobody would say they can't have their production plant. And data is the currency of the 21st century is a metaphor I've used. And you have an incredible opportunity. In every crisis, there's opportunity to re-educate based on the experience of every man, woman, child who touches a device in the next couple of months off the back of the experience, this extraordinary transformational experience we've all been through. So grab that opportunity, because it really should help change the narrative into the future.
It's a double opportunity with all this, as Tom rightly says, with the Green Deal coming out of Europe, with the whole new forming of the government around decarbonisation of all aspects of our society. When you consider, and for the purpose of this discussion, you know, is there 50,000 megawatts of potential green generating capacity in and around Ireland right now?
Oh, look, you'll understand me. There's some funny numbers being thrown around, and I'm conscious there's programs for government being discussed, and there's quite, I would say, visionary views being put forward. But look, there is no question. The answer to this, there's no question that from Galway right around to Cork, there is unquestionably very significant potential for offshore wind, particularly when floating technology becomes cost effective. And we're committed as part of our 5-year plan to actually do the studies around that and to start next year. And to, you know, I respect people having these big visionary statements, but let's start to do some work on it. Let's start figuring out what a master plan might look like. Let's start figuring out what an offshore grid might look like. And then we can start to put numbers on the export potential. But look, it is very, very significant. There's no question about it.
And I think you framed it really well there. And I'd suggest that it's an untapped natural resource that in previous generations, if we had gold and diamonds and all the rest, it would have been seen as something very spectacular and very special. And now we're entering a phase where we can export that either as green electrons at one value, as you say, through interconnects, etc. The second one is through green data with all the economic and job multipliers that we've discussed. And the third then, I guess, which is the new technologies coming, the likes of green hydrogen, which is like storage and stuff. So there's a wonderful green story and it's not just going to be hooked into, because one of the criticisms put towards foreign direct investment often is, what if they go? What if they leave?
Yeah.
It's been this way since I was in the foreign direct investment space in the 80s. What if DEC leaves? What if IBM leaves? And guess what happens? Is because we've got the pedigree, DEC leaves and the executives set up Dell. IBM leaves and the executives set up Gateway. Gateway leave and they set up Google. Is that pedigree of constant flow of talent. And I think that that's the green, that there's a confluence there of technologies and timing that could really...
Could I just come in there? Because, you know, when Bord na Móna, that's a long time ago, they had to start off with heavy engineering. They had to train up young engineers and bring in apprentices, and they built practically all of their own plant. And that's left a massive skill there. I was lucky enough to visit, is it Cuxhaven, that North German port, where they do a lot of the building, the really heavy engineering for the floating offshore. And now I know that we're looking out for a strategic port along the East Coast. And I've no doubt that those skills that were, and those that initiative and that pedigree that you mentioned that became apparent when Bord na Móna started out can easily be transferred to, you know, wherever they're going to build this heavy engineering ports, and create a massive range of jobs as well in order to create the offshore grid that you talk about. So, you know, it's quite an exciting prospect. And while in some cases looking at the green agenda for reducing carbon over the next number of years, to say it's overly ambitious, I think it depends on how we look at it. Who would have ever thought that we would have made the strides in terms of upskilling ourselves, in terms of working remotely in 7 or 8 weeks than we've done? You know, it looked like a 3 or 4 year project. And when we had to do it, we did it. And likewise, I think if this new government go to pursue the green agenda very enthusiastically, the country, the people, and the industries and the investments will pursue very quickly and would support it.
Yeah.
Thank you. We've got a few questions from the audience. Do you mind if I get a couple of, ask you these ones, if that's all right? Sorry, I had one there that I wanted to ask you. Just because you were talking a little bit there about talent. Just one second, sorry, where is it now? So this is a question I think that always comes up in this industry, from Pat McLaughlin. What's the direct employment impact of data centers, say, per square meter? How many people are employed in the data centers in Ireland on a full-time basis, and what do they do? Engineering, IT, software, and maintenance. I'd like to get a feel for the skills involved.
There's about a 5-to-1 direct to indirect metric that's globally used for data centers. The amount of people that work in the center versus those that are supporting it. From, you know, as the person who asked the question rightly says, there's a whole food chain from the electricity generation right the way through the technical stuff to the software. And then that's even before you extend the data aspect of it down to the silicon docs. And Facebook and Google and Microsoft and all these other companies that are actually mining the data, working the data, analyzing the data that sits in the center.
Yeah. Because
the center is actually just a repository for the data. But the metric that we use, the direct and indirect, is 5-to-1. That seems to be a global number. And it sort of ties into something that Tom said earlier as well, is that in such an uncertain future, in certain other industries, including aviation, maybe hospitality, maybe retail, the good news is that the skills and services of a very good operational facilities person or a very good process person, let's say in aviation for the sake of it, let's just say some of them are already being interviewed for roles in the data center industry as we speak. And that's great. That's great for showing people that they can transfer their skills over to another mission critical. Flying planes is mission critical. You got to do the right things to the engines in the right order. You bring that discipline into a data center, absolutely magnificent. You bring some of those customer care and customer assistance that hospitality people have automatically into a data center. It's wonderful, you know, because we were, as an industry globally, struggling with getting new talent, getting new ways of thinking. Now what we're starting to see is that some of the posts are already starting to be placed with people who maybe have a less certain future in other industries. But it's 5 to 1. There's plenty of reports out there. The best one that I've seen recently is the North Virginia Technology Council, probably the second or third largest data center cluster in the world. Ireland will be in the top 5, but that has a really good comprehensive economic breakdown. And the IDA and Grant Thornton did a report in Ireland about 2 years ago. But 5 to 1 is usually the metric.
Great, thank you. There's a few questions here, so I'm going to kind of bring them all in together, right? And it's about the location of data centers, and then some questions are a little bit more specific about how they're positioned and can they or should be closer to the likes of wind farms. So I'm just going to read one question, and hopefully that'll encompass some of the other questions. So there was additional capacity planned for Athenry to cater for the now shelved Apple data center. There are plans to incentivize data centers to look outside of the East Coast to locate data centers and to avail more of available wind on the West Coast. Few kind of similar questions like that. Would Mark or
yeah, look, yeah, and that's a fact. I think Dublin is under a fair degree of pressure. An awful lot of plant has gone in there in the last, or demand customers have gone in there in the last number of years. There has been, and it's like this happens with big cities. There is inevitably an over concentration close to big cities. But with technological developments, I think it would be really healthy for your sector. It would be really healthy for Ireland Inc. It would be really helpful for rural Ireland in terms of getting some of the action here. If some data centres could be built outside Dublin, I'd love to see one in the Midlands, for example. The Athenry one is in play. I understand that Apple are selling it, and potentially I assume it's going to go to somebody in that space. But the distribution of demand centres around the country, I think everybody wins in that context. And particularly rural Ireland getting a slice of this really high tech and very valuable sector.
I think also, though, people should realize that clusters are clusters, whether they're pharmaceutical, life sciences, or data centers. You know, you could turn this around and say, let's get some of the pharmaceutical action in the Midlands as well. Why is it all going to Cork? Let's get some of the bio because clusters have talent groups, they've got educational groups. And then when I'm asked that question always, I say, you know, the center, remember, as I said earlier, is only where the data resides. The magic in the whole thing is the data. Without data, you have a shed. Without a client that has servers and data, you have very sophisticated, expensive sheds. So when you look at the global, and let's do this because it's important to get context. You've Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, and Paris in Dublin, in Europe. FLAP, they're called, and Dublin. The 5. They all have similar challenges with electricity. It's because you've got things called data proximity zones, where they need to be in proximity. Data needs to be in proximity with other data sets. And that allows for, so when you have your phone or you have a device, it's looking at 10 or 20 data centers. And unless they're close to each other, there's challenges. You also have the likes of the big cloud guys, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, who need to have their own servers close to each other for what they call availability zones. And so it's the same challenge globally. However, what I haven't heard, and I like to think I'm informed, I'm not sure that there are incentives. I haven't seen big incentives to bring data centers to Ireland. I haven't seen big incentives to put data centers around the country, because ultimately then you have other questions about other industries competing. I think if you want to understand why data centers cluster, it's because of the data. The good news,
yeah, I understand that.
The good news is that those proximity zones for the big four are expanding. And I would anticipate that in the greater metro Dublin area, I'm sorry to use that for places like Dundalk and places like Kildare and places like Wicklow, that you will see that natural expansion because the data is relative. And I would see that definitely the greater metro, as you saw, as Tom has said, in Clonee for Facebook, you've seen a recent one in Dundalk for Amazon. You've seen some activity down in Wicklow. And I anticipate you're going to see some more. The other then, and most important, if I can just finalize, is we, in the same way as we used to export floppy disks, access to ports for 40-foot containers to go to our market in Europe is so important. Very little of our data goes to the West. Very little of our goes to America. The products and services go to Europe. The closer you can be to the fibers that leave the island, the less likelihood some dude's going to hit it with a JCB. It comes down to disaster recovery resilience. So my sense is right now the Metro Dublin will expand in line with the proximity zones from the data companies, not the centre. But I think that that'll be evolutionary and the data will dictate the location, optimum location of the centre.
Thank you.
I think we're furiously agreeing, in fact, Garry, in the sense that that Dublin Metro Zone, whatever you want to call it, but it's expanding, and it's expanding in an appropriate manner because you can get good sites and you can get good access to power and fibre, of course. So.
And close to the off-island fibres, yes, I tend to agree.
We've loads of questions here, so I'm going to try and get through a few more before we finish up. So Declan Power, I'm just going to ask his question because what an appropriate name. Perhaps now more than ever, the current situation and the future new normal highlights the importance of both the data center and sustainable energy sectors. Any thoughts how we can translate this into the second and third level education areas and attract high caliber future recruits that will be highly needed to drive innovation and continue to attract external investments and jobs to our country?
You know, in advance of COVID, we had full employment. There has been a change possibly in the current norm, which isn't the new norm. I don't think this is just the current norm. We don't know what the new and next norm will be. I think we're going to see, as we said earlier, some of the more traditional industries that have a 3 to 5 year recovery in aviation and some of the others that just we know. We may see a skills transfer. I know I have a 17-year-old inside here doing her Leaving Cert next year. And some of the buddies in her class who were going to be in the hospitality side are saying, I think I'm going to go towards an ICT role. I think that's an interesting thing, because who would have thought that 3 months ago? Mark said something interesting earlier, and I think Tom also, is it'll also be post this, the transfer of skills in and out of countries. How will that all unfold? You know, and we don't have clarity on that, do we? Will there be as much transfer of people? University graduates coming here to, you know, there's a lot of unknowns. For now, we have to take it what we know within our own island, I think. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think our last graduate program, 30% were from outside the country, and as far away as some of the, I think there was a guy from Afghanistan, like extraordinary, very highly qualified engineer. Can I make a quick point, Michelle? You pick up the Irish Times every day, there's a full page ad from the government on what phase we're in, all the details about the COVID crisis, the do's and the don'ts. The communication around this crisis has, I think, been exemplary from government. And I am answering the gentleman's question, Declan Power's question. When we get into the gritty business of driving the climate action plan and reducing carbon, our biggest challenge is actually convincing people of what's needed to do that. Whether it's an onshore wind farm down the road from you, a transmission line upgrade, or whatever, we've got to get into this sort of hyper communications and education program that's very, very cross-functional, where government, all the key actors in the industry speak with one voice, and that there's really, really strong communication on the whys, why we have to do this, what's needed, and that that message moves into the education sector. I gave a young student in his final year in environmental economics. He asked me for some advice. I know his dad had played tennis with his dad. He was doing a project, his final year project. He had never heard of the Climate Action Plan. Fourth year college environmental economics, never heard of the Climate Action Plan. We've a hell of a job to do in education and communication.
You know, even last year, there was a tremendously successful, because we talk about graduates and we talk about university. And when I look at sort of one of the most exciting things I saw last year was in your trade, Tom, where there was the apprenticeship program. You know, people actually going back into apprenticeships, you know, even after they'd had full degrees, going back, and you get down to the ordeal. That's a wonderful thing that the people, because ICT in 10 years will be like an apprenticeship. At the moment, we have this up in the lights of you have to be a rocket scientist to get into it. It's really now getting to the stage where there's more jobs in applying those skills than there is inventing the skills, or as many jobs at least. And that's why I applaud the construction side. They reinvigorated this apprenticeship thing, which I thought was very excited.
Well, I suppose just on that, Garry, about like before the country was locked down, construction sites were open, and the public sort of opinion got really aggressive towards the industry. From what they could see, there was social distancing wasn't being practiced properly, and families were concerned about their husbands or sons or whatever, sisters or brothers going on to site and so on. And then when we were closed down, we set together to try and correct that. And you know, we put together a standard operating procedure. We got part of the LEAF and we fed into the government protocol, and we had agreements with the unions and so on. And by the time we went back, and there was nervousness about going back last Monday week, but it transpired there was almost full social acceptance for going back. Wanted to see construction. Even the government have big signs up now of a construction worker on a roof and saying you're welcome back. Some of the big filling stations have big signs up saying, you know, come in and get your breakfast roll again, you're very welcome. So I think the same is going to really have to happen about the whole data centers. Like, you need to build the social acceptance of that. It has a fantastic story to tell, and all of us wouldn't be able to be doing what we're doing if it wasn't for that facility that's there. So I don't know how, you know, it's a tricky one to know how to do, but social acceptance is awfully important.
Change will always be a challenge, any form of change. You know, change in the way you do things, change in the way we operate. Change has been forced upon us now over the last 4 weeks. So the little gene in our head, or the guy in the organization that said that could never be done, is being disproved. So people have, you know, boards of directors. I said earlier that Microsoft announced that they have seen and achieved within their own business units and the industries they're working with 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months. 2 years. We have partners that got ISO 9001 accreditation over Zoom recently. I mean, when you think about that for a moment, you said you set up a whole new training program, and people are all, once, it's amazing the way, and we always used to say this when we were building stuff, and I'm sure you're the same. It's amazing how the strategy is made up of tactical things that work out, and you rewrite it afterwards. And it could be that change. When you combine the change of acceptance that the tools and services that we're using, the data, reside in centers. If they're being fueled by renewable energy, then we're ticking all the boxes. And then we look at the economic and job multipliers. And we can all start to feel a bit better about ourselves. You know, and it's even to the point that I made earlier. You read in general a lot about Ireland's laggard status when it comes to carbon. And that is absolutely probably correct. When you look at Mark and David Connolly's and the Irish Solar, when we looked at it here with all this report, 40% from effectively starting from scratch, what, less than a decade ago, hitting the target of 40%, a self-imposed target, that should be applauded. That should be amplified more. And then we should say, we want more. We want more. Whereas we're weighed down with this, oh, we're rubbish at that and we're rubbish at this. We're actually really good at a lot of things. Data, exporting, foreign direct investment, getting up off our ass and doing things we're really good at. And this is one of the industries, combined with Mark's and your own, that has at least something very tangible post-COVID that we want to get going on, really get going on.
Great, thank you, Garry. And on that positive note, we have hit the top of the hour, so we're going to finish up. There's loads of questions. I'm really sorry we didn't get to them all. The audience are really engaged, and you know, that's thanks to you panelists, Mark Foley, Tom Parlon and Garry Connolly. Really appreciate your time. And we will send out the report. We will have a recording of this, which will be made available online and in the email. So with that, thank you, everybody, and we shall talk to you soon.
Thank you very much, Michelle.